Somewhere between month 1 and year 30, your money quietly switches jobs, and almost nobody notices the exact day it happens.
In her very first year of putting money away, Amara's account grew by $94.94.
3 decades later, in that same account, a single year added over $23,000. Same woman.
Same fund, same $300 leaving her checking account every month on the same date without fail.
So what actually changed? Nothing about the rate, nothing about the fund. Only one thing moved, the size of the pile that 7% was allowed to chew on.
Amara almost walked away at year 9. Most people do walk away around there.
The line on her balance chart looked dead flat for so long that it stopped feeling like progress and started feeling like proof she'd picked the wrong plan.
It wasn't dead, it was loading.
And the number that would have told her to hang on, the one number that predicts whether you're 12 months from liftoff or about to fold your hand right before the flop. Almost nobody ever
learns to watch it. There's an exact balance where compounding stops limping and starts sprinting. Under that line, your own paycheck is out, earning the market.
Over it, the market starts out, turning you permanently. Where does that line actually sit? Stay past the boring part, or the boring part wins.
Let's strip away every excuse and just run clean numbers. Here's how we lock the experiment so the math has nowhere left to hide.
Amara is 27. She coordinates logistics for a regional distribution company. Her take: home lands around $56,000 a year. Once rent, groceries, gas, and her phone plan are covered, she's left with roughly $380 spare a month.
She commits 300 of it every single month into one broad low cost index fund. No day trading, no chasing hot tickers, no timing the dips.
Same contribution, same fund, same habit, repeated for 30 straight years.
To keep this fair, we hold every variable steady, same income, same $300 deposit, same broad index fund, same 7% real return, which roughly tracks what a diversified U.S.
stock portfolio has historically returned once inflation is stripped out, and the same 30-year runway.
The single variable allowed to move from one year to the next is the size of the account itself.
Ready to see how that stacks up against what most new savers expect the first time they check their balance.
Here's the trap almost everyone falls into before they've even started. When people picture saving, they picture a straight ramp upward.
12 months of $300 equals $3,600. 10 years of that equals $36,000.
20 years equals 72,000. 30 years equals 108,000. That straight diagonal line is what your brain expects because it's simple arithmetic on a napkin.
But markets don't grow in a straight line. They grow on top of whatever's already sitting there.
And the gap between that napkin line and the real line is exactly the stretch where most people give up.
Let's leave inside Amara's first 10 years, because this is the part nobody shows you in the highlight reel.
By the close of year 1, she's deposited $3,600 of her own money. The market handed back roughly $94 on top.
Her balance sits near $3,700. That's the whole return, $94 for 12 consecutive months of discipline. It genuinely feels like the account is malfunctioning. By year 3, she's put in $10,800.
Her balance is close to $12,000, meaning the market has quietly handed her about $1,200 of free money.
Spread across 3 years, that's roughly $400 annually, or about $33 a month.
Practically invisible sitting next to the 300, she's contributing herself.
By year 5, her total contributions reach $18,000, and her balance sits around $21,500.
That year alone, the market adds close to $1,400, about $116 a month. She's beating inflation. That's the actual goal. But the number on the screen still looks small enough to be a rounding error. Small numbers aren't failure. They're the entry fee. By the 10-year mark, Amara has personally funded $36,000.
Her balance reads close to 51,000. Over an entire decade of unbroken discipline, the market has added roughly 15,000.
This is the night she sits at her kitchen table with a calculator and does the math out loud. 10 years.
$36,000 of her own paychecks in, $15,000 to show for it from the market.
Her market gain that single year is around 300, barely under what she contributed herself.
The full decade of patience just to catch up to her own contribution rate. She's maybe 4 years ahead of where a plain savings account would have left her. That's the entire reward after 10 years of sacrifice. And if her friends had spent that decade chasing meme stocks instead, more than a few of them would be telling her she played it far too safe. Nobody warns you about this stretch, so why does the curve stay flat that long, and is it actually broken, or is something else going on underneath? Here's the mechanism almost no one explains.
Our research team at Navira invests dug into exactly why the first decade feels this dead, and it isn't bad luck, a weak market year, or a contribution problem.
It's simple physics. Growth is calculated on the balance, not on your deposit. When the balance is tiny, 7% of a tiny number is still a tiny number. 7% of 10,000 is 700. 7% of 50,000 is 500. 7% of 250,000 is 17,500. 7% of 500,000 is 35,000.
Same rate, same fund, same disciplined saver, wildly different dollar results depending purely on the size of the pile that percentage is working on.
That's the entire secret hiding inside every boring 10-year stretch.
Most online calculators only show you the finish line, the number designed to excite you, and they skip the year-by-year velocity, the number that actually decides whether you keep going or quit.
Early, so our team mapped 3 distinct stages where the underlying math genuinely shifts.
Almost nobody learns the names of these stages, which means almost nobody can tell you which one they're currently standing on, or how far away the next one is. Stage 1, we call the ignition floor anything below $50,000. At this stage, your annual market growth is smaller than what an average middle income saver can personally contribute.
A $300 monthly habit equals $3,600 a year. A $30,000 balance at 7% only returns about $2,100.
Your own paycheck is outworking the market. It genuinely feels like pure saving, because functionally it still is.
This is where most disciplined accounts sit for that entire painful first decade, and it's exactly the stage where most people walk away.
Stage 2 is the pivot band, $50,000 to $100,000. This is where the scales start to even out. At $75,000, 7% works out to about $200 a year, more than the $3,600 Amara personally deposits. For the first time, the market is contributing more than her paycheck is. The curve begins to bend, though it doesn't feel dramatic yet.
It just feels like the account has finally started noticing she exists. Stage 3 is the ignition threshold, anything above $250,000. Here, the annual dollar growth blows past anything a typical middle income saver could ever contribute directly.
7% of 250,000 is 17,500, nearly 5 times Amara's own yearly deposit.
Her contribution becomes a rounding error. The account is now doing essentially all the heavy lifting. This is where the line goes vertical, and this is precisely the stage most people quit right before reaching.
The ignition point isn't luck, it's arithmetic waiting for enough fuel. Want to know how close most households actually get to that ignition line?
The answer might explain everything. Our team pulled figures from a major national household wealth survey, one of the broadest studies of retirement savings by age group anywhere. And the pattern is almost painfully clean. The typical retirement balance for households under 35 sits close to $19,000.
For ages 35 to 44, it climbs to roughly $45,000. For ages 45 to 54, the midpoint lands near $115,000.
For ages 55 to 64, the final stretch before retirement, the midpoint reaches about $185,000.
Read that one more time. The typical household at its peak earning years is sitting just past the pivot band and still nowhere near the ignition threshold.
Their compounding never gets the runway it needed to do its real job. That's not a discipline failure.
That's not a willpower failure. It's a math failure, real people, funding real accounts, and the curve quitting on them before they ever quit on the curve.
Now let's step into the back half of Amara's timeline, the part almost nobody gets to witness inside their own account because most people never stay long enough to see it.
By year 15, she's personally deposited $4,000. Her balance sits close to $2,000. She's cleared the ignition floor and is deep inside the pivot band.
That year's market gain alone is roughly $200, meaning the market is now out, contributing her own paycheck by about $2,600 a year.
The tide has officially turned. By year 20, her total deposits reach $72,000. Her balance is near $153,000.
That year, the market adds roughly $900, nearly triple what she personally puts in.
She has effectively tripled her money across that second decade, not because the market got more generous, but purely because the pile got bigger.
By year 25, her contributions total $90,000. Her balance is close to $238,000, right on the doorstep of the ignition threshold.
That year's market gain alone is around $16,000, more than 4 times her own yearly deposit.
If Amara had quit at year 10, none of this second decade ever happens. The first decade quietly did the grinding work.
The second decade is where that grinding work finally gets paid out, and it pays out in a way the first decade gave her absolutely no evidence to expect.
The slow years aren't wasted. They're the ones doing the real construction.
Now, the honest counterpoint, because there are real conditions under which this story falls apart, and we owe you the full picture, not just the highlight reel.
If you genuinely can't stay invested the full 30 years, this backloaded math simply doesn't rescue you.
If you need that money at year 12 for a house down payment, you're pulling out near the bottom of the pivot band, not near the top.
Compounding rewards time left on the clock. It punishes an early exit without mercy.
If your money sits inside a high, fee actively managed fund instead of a low cost index, the math shifts against you.
A 1% annual expense ratio sounds harmless, but stretched across 30 years, it can strip out roughly $60,000 from Amara's final balance, close to a fifth of her entire
Ending number quietly siphoned off in fees. The ignition threshold still exists. It just moves further up the mountain, and you may not reach it until well after your working years are over.
If the real return turns out closer to 5% instead of 7%, the threshold itself doesn't move, but the time required to reach it stretches out considerably.
At 5%, Amara's year 30 balance drops from roughly $360,000 down to about $248,000.
Same shape, gentler slope, the vertical climb simply arrives later, possibly after her working life has already ended.
And if Amara had started 15 years later at age 40, 2 instead of 27, even doubling her monthly contribution wouldn't be enough?
15 years in, her balance lands well under $250,000. She never reaches ignition inside her working career.
The math still functions perfectly. The clock simply runs out first.
But for the saver who starts in her 20s, stays the full 3 decades, and keeps her money in a low-cost, broad index fund, the outcome holds exactly the way Amara's does.
Let's land the long-term numbers, because this is the payoff everything else has been building toward.
By the end of year 30, Amara has personally deposited $108,000 across 3 decades.
Her balance sits near $360,000. Her market gain in that final year alone is roughly $3,400.
Say that number out loud. The market handed her more in a single year than she contributed across any 6 full years of her own saving combined.
Year 30 by itself outproduces the entire first decade of contributions put together. The velocity comparison tells the cleanest version of this story.
In year 1, the market added about $94. In year 30, it added roughly 3,400.
That's close to 250 times more dollar growth in a single year, off the exact same rate, the exact same fund, and the exact same $300 monthly habit.
The only variable that ever moved was the size of the pile that 7% had to work with. This is the actual mechanics behind the phrase people throw around, compounding catches fire.
It isn't poetry. It's simply what 7% does to a small number versus a massive one. Year 1 whispers.
Year 30 shouts, her year. 1 deposit and her year. 30 deposit were identical, $300 a month either way.
But the market's contribution in year 30 dwarfed year 1 by roughly 250 times. That's the floor velocity problem finally resolving itself.
And her very last deposits, made in that final stretch, barely get any time to compound before she stops working, which almost doesn't matter, because the real work was already finished by the
Deposits she made back in her late 20s and 30s, left alone to sit for 2 and 3 full decades.
Here's the full scoreboard, one clean pass, same $300 monthly, same 7% real return, patient saver, no shortcuts.
Year 10, roughly 50. 1,000 in the ignition floor, annual market gain near 3,300.
Year 20, roughly 150, 3,000 climbing through the pivot band, annual market gain near 9,900.
Year 30, roughly 360,000 past the ignition threshold, annual market gain near 20, 3,400.
Same $300 the entire way through. 3 completely different financial realities produced from one unchanging habit. So here's the actual reframe worth sitting with. The trap was never saving too little. It was never picking the wrong fund. The real trap is reading those flat first 10 years as proof it isn't working, and walking away right before the curve does the exact thing you signed up for.
Compounding never lies to you. It just doesn't warn you in year 5 that year 25 is going to look completely different.
The math is backloaded on purpose. The people who win this game aren't smarter than the people who quit.
They simply stayed seated at the table long enough for the percentage to finally have real dollars worth multiplying.
So which stage are you actually standing on right now? Not the number your retirement app projects for some future date. The number your account will show the year you stop adding to it.
The ignition floor under 50,000. The pivot band between 50 and 100,000. Or the ignition threshold past 250,000.
That's the number worth checking tonight, not the projection 20 years out, but exactly where you're standing today, and where that same spot lands you a decade from now, if nothing else changes.
And if you're already wondering what happens when you double this contribution, or start at 40 instead of 27, or run this exact same math inside a tax-advantaged account,
Building that video next, and the shape of the curve stays the same even as the vertical point shifts with every input you change.
If this breakdown handed you a piece of the math, nobody ever sat you down and explained. Hit like on this video and subscribe to Amara Invests, because we run these exact numbers on the money.
Decisions that will actually shape your next 20 years. We'll see you in the next one, right at the point where your curve starts to bend.